Yes, you're moving on to the next topic.
Yes. Pam, you were going to start us off on treatment for hepatitis C.
Yes, thank you. Take people right back to the beginning when we explained how many people we'd seen with various disorders and illnesses. And we actually met with 50 people who were infected with hepatitis C. And I think it's fair to say on behalf of all three of us that it was truly shocking to hear for the first time just the experience of these people who had been treated with interferon and ribavirin. They described it as grueling, similar to chemotherapy, which lasted months and in some cases years. A small number of these people said they were given clear information to help them prepare for the impact of the treatment. And a good example here was a couple who were both being treated and able to plan that, so one had the treatment before the other, whereas others felt they entered it quite naively. And I think all three of us heard the phrase that we had heard from a number of people that said, this was the worst year of my life. People certainly articulated suicidal thoughts, and people seriously had contemplated taking their own lives because they could not see an end to how they felt. They described a very, very debilitating illness, extreme tiredness, staying in bed for days and days and days, not coming downstairs, literally for weeks, to be with their family. Hair loss, significant weight loss, and also profound impact, not surprisingly, on their own emotional and mental health. Many of the effects of the treatments have endured and have become lifelong conditions. I need to talk about a young woman with thalassemia who had been engaged to be married when she started the treatment. She was in her early 20s then. Until that point, she'd had a life where she'd been very successful. She'd managed her thalassemia well with a very, very supportive family. Then learning about her hepatitis C and starting with the treatment absolutely changed her life to the extent that she certainly suffers with a great deal of depression, anxiety, loss of confidence. And she talks about not leaving her parents' home for a year. Her wedding that had been planned had been cancelled or was cancelled. The relationship ended. She was unable to work or consider any career prospects. The anticipated future of leading a life with a partner and a child and a professional job that she had were all lost. Sadly, she's now got cirrhosis of the liver and is deeply pessimistic about her life expectancy. A very, very sad story. We heard similar stories time and time over. Hand over to Jackie to give further examples.
I met one lady who was diagnosed ultimately with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the impact of her treatment, which she described as traumatic. And that resulted in flashbacks and ultimately a very significant mental health breakdown. And the effects of the virus and the treatment have left her with enduring severe depression and anxiety. She describes becoming mentally exhausted very quickly and uses the word overwhelmed a lot in terms of how she feels. She described the overall result of the infection and treatment as an existence of survival and coping with little contribution or fulfilment. I met one family whose relative had an uncommon, we think, reaction from the treatment, which was a very significant weight gain, and the implications of that. This lady had been an average weight, looked after herself very well, but throughout the course of the treatment, the weight gain meant she moved from a size 12 in clothes to a size 22. And the significance here was that this further led to her isolation. She felt very embarrassed. She didn't feel that she could go out shopping. Her son said to me, that she felt that people judged her because of her weight. And her son said to me that he felt like holding up a billboard saying, "This is not her fault." And so she became, as I said, further isolated, didn't go out, again then impacting on low mood and anxiety as well. As Pam said earlier, lots of families hadn't been informed of the likely impact of the treatment. A few people said to us they'd been told it would be like flu-like symptoms, which, as I'm sure people here know, doesn't go anywhere near describing the impact of that kind of treatment. But particularly, people didn't realise that the mental health and mood changes were related to the treatment. And so they went through agonies in their families, in relationships, and self-blame and blame of each other. And some relationship breakdowns because they hadn't realised that this was not the real them. This was what the medication was doing to them. Kay, you had some...
Yeah, I was just going to talk and bring it forward to around 2015 and the people who have been able to use the new direct acting antiviral treatments. And many spoke positively about this. And everyone on this treatment programme that we've met has been cleared of hepatitis C. And very few had serious side effects. And obviously there was people were really glad that it took less time, and some people felt the benefits in a much quicker time frame, with one person feeling after a couple of weeks, I really think this has worked, and it had. With regards to people receiving the treatment, there was this kind of double-edged sword with this: we're the lucky ones because we're still alive and other people have died. And actually, in some situations, there were individuals that got the feeling from some of the professionals that they encountered, think yourself lucky that you're getting this. And, those kind of feelings didn't leave them in a good place. And obviously, those that hadn't had that experience were really appreciative of getting a really good service and obviously clearing the hepatitis C. One of the gentlemen that I met was really shocked that after I'd visited him early last year, he'd had the need to go to the GP and was really shocked. He's had this condition since the early 90s, that the GP was kind of telling him that he'd got hepatitis C. Well, he's known that for a long, long time. But what was more shocking was there wasn't a discussion around the new treatment. And to this day, this man still has hepatitis C, and there's a treatment available there. And that really does bring about the issue of ensuring that everybody is afforded the opportunity to go on the programme in terms of the new treatment. And, that's something that was really quite shocking to hear.
Jackie, some of the people you spoke to discussed liver transplants with you. What were you told?
Yes, we saw 4 people who had liver transplants, and I wanted to just share 2 examples of different experiences, really. One man had a successful transplant which really transformed his and his family's life, and his wife said to me that it gave them 9 of their very best years together. Sadly, the hepatitis C couldn't be cleared, and his new liver became infected. But she was very grateful for those 9 years that they did have together. Another family I spoke to who were hopeful for a liver transplant. It was the lady I spoke to just recently who had the very significant weight gain. Her liver disease progressed to cirrhosis, and when she was assessed for a liver transplant, the assessing surgeons refused to undertake the procedure because of her weight. And the family were really angry. In their words, they said she was infected by the NHS. The NHS treatment caused her weight gain, and then it was that made her not qualify to have the transplant that she then needed, and she subsequently died.
Jackie, you spoke to a number of people about end-of-life care and end-of-life experiences. Can you tell us
We
about
did.
that?
We found a range of experiences. Several people sadly talked about their loved ones experiencing very traumatic deaths, often related to multiple organ failure. Some of them were treated very appropriately and sensitively. Others had less pleasant experiences. One lady spoke to me about her mum not having a peaceful or pleasant passing. And a few people talked to us about the cruelty, how it seemed very cruel at the end of people having to have their fingers really squeezed hard, for example, to have their blood tested, etc. One lady described to me her mum, who was dying from liver failure at the age of 51, and she was in the last days of her life. And the daughter was outside of the room, leaning up on the wall outside of the room, and one of the doctors came out and he tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Cheer up, it might never happen." And she just felt that it was so cruel for anyone to say that, as her mum was so close to her life. But in contrast, she then said there was another lovely doctor who sat with them one night and very gently explained that he didn't think her mum would reach the morning, and explained to them exactly what would happen over the coming hours. And this felt like a really respectful and compassionate discussion. And what she described was just that contrast within a 24-hour period of the two different approaches in that respect. I saw another lady whose husband had hepatitis C for a long time and was then unfortunately contracted hepatitis E through food poisoning, and so he became very ill very quickly. They had a very poor experience in hospital. No specialist beds were available, and he remained in A&E. Although she was very concerned about the decline in his condition, she said, in an echo of the original experience about hepatitis C, the nurses said he was just very tired, and he actually passed away during that period. And she tried to speak to the hospital afterwards. The family complained to the hospital about the quality of care that had been received, and it took a year for this complaint to be dealt with. And the hospital said that they'd done all they could do, and they couldn't find any learning from that. The family felt really strongly fobbed off. And this is similar to another example that we saw where a widow whose husband had died from hepatitis C went back to the hospital to ask if it had been caused by a blood transfusion which he'd had as a result of an injury. Obviously, they found out subsequently that it had. And she was asked to sit in front of a panel of 4 doctors. And this is a lady who'd just been widowed, and she was in her late 60s, early 70s. And she said, the daughter said that they all backed each other up. She was there on her own against this panel of 4 doctors, and she just felt intimidated and humiliated, really. And in both of those situations, both of those families said the family just did not have the energy to carry on with those complaints because of where they were in their bereavement and coping with the condition.
Which leads me on to my example, which is not dissimilar. I mentioned earlier about the man with leukemia who'd got hepatitis B from blood transfusion, who spent the last weeks of his life in a psychiatric ward because of the perceived need to nurse him in isolation. His wife visited the hospital needing to travel on 2 different bus routes. Took her certainly upwards of 2.5 hours either way. At the point that he was ending his life, his family weren't informed that his death was imminent. On the day that he died, his wife took her usual lengthy bus route, and she'd taken flowers to celebrate the fact that it was their wedding anniversary. And when she arrived at the hospital, she went to the ward and saw the empty bed. And that's how she'd been told that he'd died. She's still alive, and I met with her, a very stoic lady, and a bit similar to what Jackie has just mentioned, hadn't got the energy and the emotional energy to take this matter forward. So a truly tragic death for this man and his family. Okay, I think you
Wanted to move on. We've touched on a number of people spoke about the impact of losing loved ones to early and traumatic deaths, and one of the families that I met had lost their child. This was a family whose teenager had had an accident, needed to have a blood transfusion, and very quickly after that transfusion she became very, very poorly, and after a few months she died, and she was 14. Losing anybody is difficult. Losing a child is something that people will say is forever life-changing as well in terms of that. And there was a sibling as well, and the impact on the sibling was significant. Her voice in this process, I would like to share with you. There is nothing worse than the loss of your child. It destroys your whole life. I had so much time off work, I was almost sacked. It changes your personality, and it's devastating, and you just function day to day, and there are no words to describe it. I just want to say a little bit about this lady who, again, never we described about all our families, was a lady. She's now 80 years old. The death was quite a significant number of years ago, and she's had to compartmentalise how she deals with that to be able to go on for her other child and obviously the family. But she felt so strongly for this inquiry that she had a voice. And Sir Brian, she was so grateful that the intermediary process was available for her to be able to honour her daughter's memory and be able to have a voice in this process. And I think that is a really, really important part of, you said earlier on, this was a new process. It was so important, in particular in that case, and I would say in all cases, that this option was available.
One of the things that we recognised, and something that people said to us was, those losses are tragic and traumatic for the individual families. But we recognise as well that those deaths were a loss to the wider community and to society itself, really. There were examples of the local undertaker, who was such a support to his local community, the much-loved school lunchtime supervisor, the nurse who died too early at age 51, all people who provide excellent services to their community and to society overall. One man spoke to us about the lost potential of his brother, who died at 23. And this young man was a talented musician and singer with excellent academic achievements. His brother said, "I know that, had he lived, he would have made a huge contribution somehow. He studied medicine at Oxford and then changed courses to study law and achieved a first-class degree. He was a polymath. His death at 23 meant the whole country missed out on what he could have contributed."
Kay, can I ask you then to move us on to the next topic, which is access to psychological support?
So I just wanted to start this area looking at kind of it historically. So looking at those that were infected in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was quite a common theme with regards to there were very few examples of those that received or were offered psychological services. Some did, but may have had to seek that out themselves. So one of the other things that I encountered was some people I spoke to who would have found it really hard to ask for help and support. And the need for specialist psychological services can never be underestimated in terms of those people who need to have that time and that longer therapeutic period in their lives to be able to work through some of the issues that have been around for many, many years. And the whole issue nationally, I know, is being addressed around mental health and stigma. And I know there's lots of efforts nationally now, and some spoke of how positive that is. And we can open the doors for some of those people that need that service now, even if it was 30 or 40 years ago, as well as those more recent. Some spoke of, if it was a tailored psychological support for people, it's important for people to know the history of infected blood and blood products and the whole history of that. Others may have commented on, actually, those professionals can learn some of that away from the therapeutic environment, but actually it's important that they have some knowledge of it so they can actually work with clients and work with them and their experience of the environment. Yeah, I'll hand over.
So, Kay, can I just ask, were any of the people that you spoke to offered psychological support in the early days of the infections?
In the early days, for myself, that was no.
No, is that the same for the both?
Almost exclusively, yeah. I saw one lady who was asked to go to a group in respect of her condition, and when she got there, she was in a group of people who had addiction problems, and she felt that was highly inappropriate for her situation. And then another one where an infected person who was themselves a health professional was asked to lead a group, and again she felt that blurred the boundaries between herself as someone who was experiencing the issue. I did speak to one woman who had two different experiences. She was referred to an NHS psychologist who told her that she must have had a death wish because she'd had a relationship with somebody who was infected. But she then later sought help through the Hepatitis C Trust, who were incredibly helpful to her and supportive, and arranged for private counselling for her, which was excellent in taking her forward. So some very different experiences there.
I can end this section on two positives. The young woman I've talked about intermittently with thalassemia, she had received counselling intermittently over the years, in the first instance around the treatment around thalassemia and how that impacted on her life. But then, of course, as she became hepatitis C, she began to have a different type of bespoke therapy around her particular needs. And that has continued. The therapy or the counsellor has been flexible in the sense of being able to be responsive to what she's needed at that time, and she feels that has been a lifeline. My second example is quite different. A woman who'd had the treatment, she'd had interferon and ribavirin, had been through an horrendous time, was one of those people who talked about it being the worst year of her life and feeling suicidal. It wasn't successful. She then had the new treatment a number of years later. Her doctor, her GP, she describes as being fabulous, and had talked her through how she needed to exercise and said, do 100 yards this week, do 200 yards next week, go round the lake, etc., to the point that she felt fit and healthy. And at that point, he and the surgery hosted a tea party for her and her family to go to the surgery and have this tea party. And she said, again, it was a lifeline that the GP and the surgery got her through those times. So we do have these exceptional experiences from some of the people that we saw.
For those people that you spoke to that hadn't had any psychological support or counselling, was that something they'd be interested in if it was available?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So,
Across the board?
Yes.
yes.
Yes, I think that there may be some work to do around those that maybe say, oh, I don't, you know, like I feel like I'm lucky I'm alive, and just some gentle work there to do around just how important they are and how much they deserve that. But I think in the main, the majority would say yes. But I know of one gentleman that I spoke to when the issue of the enhanced financial arrangements came around for the psychological impact, really struggled in even recognising his own depression. His wife saw it, as did another family I can think of with the couple, but they were struggling because they just felt so lucky they were alive that they weren't recognising their own depression and anxiety, and that had manifested itself in so many ways, in particular being housebound, that there'd just be some work to do, and that they deserve that.
So the people you spoke to aren't being offered any psychological support?
No.
No,
No.
not then and not now.
Not then and not now.
And the key thing was that people just would have liked to have been offered, and then they could have exercised their judgment about whether to accept that. But for the great majority of the people we saw, they were never offered. It was never discussed.
Okay, can I ask you then to move us on to what I think is the last theme in your report, which is financial support?
Okay, so the majority of people that we heard from with regards to hepatitis C had been told by professionals about the Skipton Fund. Others found out through the press or through relatives, and some didn't know about it until it became a bigger part of the inquiry. So there was kind of a group of people, the majority, who did know, but there were others, and I even had one gentleman who found out because it was through reading somebody's story in a magazine, and then thought, oh, right, I can apply for this, and did, and obviously was awarded. People spoke positively about the current schemes, but all expressed anxiety that this support might be reduced as part of austerity measures, meaning that they can't rely on it for long-term financial plans. And there were some who felt that payments were inadequate for others across the different areas, different awards, and that they'd like some kind of agreement moving forward, that there's parity with that. One of the things we discussed was around financial support, but also financial impact. So many of the people that we spoke to had suffered financial impact because a partner had to give up work to look after their husband. And I think that the lady I met said, I love my job, but I love my husband more. And that financially impacted on them, but she had to give up work because he was so poorly in terms of his mental health and his physical health. And it was common for issues such as not being able to get life insurance, mortgages, holiday insurance. Some people didn't apply for jobs because of the fear of being asked the questions around their medical health, and they didn't want to share that. And I had one particular professional that worked in the medical field that says, I've been ill all my life. I'm always having tests. My life revolved around work at a hospital as a professional nurse and being a patient. I love my work, but it affected my prospects. So I couldn't progress in my career, and it's what I really wanted to do. And that at the end of that section, there's also in the report mention of the family who lost the child not being able to afford the funeral and having to get a loan and borrow money to actually be able to bury their child.
I met a family who had to borrow money from friends, and this was because during the period that the husband was having interferon and ribavirin treatment. This took 2 years altogether because he had to keep having pauses to allow his immune system to recover. And they had no income for 18 months, and they used up their savings within 6 months. His wife worked part-time, and that meant that they weren't able to access any benefits. They didn't know about the Skipton Fund or anything like that. And the only help they got was a £10 reduction on their council tax during that time. So, as I said, they had to borrow from families, and they found out about the Skipton Fund in a happenstance way as well, and thankfully were able to repay their relatives for the money that they'd loaned to them during that period.
And just to finish off in this section, we had a situation for 2 particular families who'd lost their fathers through infected blood resulting in hepatitis B. And currently there is no financial support available for this condition. One of the dependents sadly had died, the other dependent is still alive and very much in need of financial support, having lost her husband, who I referred to earlier on as a self-employed businessman, and having lost all access to any type of benefits and payments. So that's an anomaly within the system still as well.
And the end of your report, you set out the hopes that those that you spoke to, that their hopes for the inquiry. I wonder whether you can just emphasise some of those key themes emerging from that.
To return to where we started off, and the fact that we felt very humbled and privileged to be part of interviewing these people and represent them at the inquiry. The majority of people we know describe themselves as the lucky ones because they'd survived. And we heard this at the beginning of so many of our interviews. In our interviews, the people that we met, they were stoic, they were resilient, but also sensitive to the situation of those who had died, very much so, and their bereaved families and people currently who were ill and receiving treatment. And so their messages to the inquiry are messages that I think the inquiry has heard throughout its time, throughout the time that you've been hearing evidence from those infected and affected until this point. So I won't go through all of what our folks said because you've already heard them, so some of the messages are the same. But we know as experts by their experience, they're the experts, not we three, they're certainly the experts. And they gave a very powerful collective picture, revealing those clear common patterns and themes. And that their commonality, they would like to see a clear timeline of when infected products were first used and when this stopped, along with an understanding of how decisions were made along this timeline to continue using those products, how risks were considered, and whether this was assessed as a risk worth taking. They particularly want to know what people in authority knew about the risks of infected blood when making strategic and clinical treatment decisions to continue its use. They want the people responsible to be held to account and to explain whether their decisions were made in good faith on the basis of what was known, or whether there were other drivers such as finance. Some were concerned about a cover-up and wanted to know if this had happened and who was responsible. They wanted the public to know more about their experience, to replace myths with facts, and thereby to reduce the stigma associated with infections. They want the public to know that they were infected through no fault of their own, and that was certainly a theme throughout. Many people said that they would like the financial support arrangements to be reviewed to make it less of a battle for people to get help. They would like certainty that the current support would not be withdrawn. Many suggested that the attempts of government organisations to reach people possibly infected with hepatitis C have been ineffective, and I think we were probably most surprised by that there was no reach-out programme for those people who had had blood transfusions or received blood during those critical years. They spoke about people carrying infections they do not yet know about, and how the lack of a recall scheme following transfusions left them with a ticking time bomb for years and an irreversible progression in their disease. They would like to see a scheme in which everyone who received blood products or blood transfusions from the 1970s until screening was fully effective would be offered a blood test. We certainly know from our work with this group that the inquiry has given them confidence to speak out. And interestingly, those people who were very, very keen to remain anonymous at the beginning of this process, by the end, and they've had contact with us, say, I feel able now to speak out, and they feel able now to be identified. Not suggesting that we identify those people today, but you can see, those of you that looked at our report, some people have identified their loved ones who've died, because they feel able now to be identified as people who've had hepatitis B, C or HIV as a cause of death of their loved ones. So this process, and Kay's already touched upon it, has given them the strength and the self-esteem and the confidence, some of that confidence back, to be able to talk about this more openly, and are very grateful for the inquiry, having heard their voice.
Is there anything else either of you two want to add before we finish?
We just want to say we are so grateful to the people who allowed us into their lives, really, and to pay testimony to them. This has been a tremendous experience for us professionally and personally, and we take our hats off to you folks.
Yeah,
We
I
do.
agree.
Ms. Scott, do you wish to check with those behind you whether anyone has any further questions?
Yes. I think that's a no, sir.
Well, I have one. It's been said to me in a number of statements that the author has lost trust in the doctors and the clinicians who have treated him, and therefore finds it difficult to accept or take medical treatment now. And I think one person has described it as the single greatest loss arising out of the infected blood events. What, if any, reflection did you have of that idea from those that you were speaking to?
I think, Sir Brian, it's around building that trust and confidence for people to be able to step into now, in particular the gentleman who's still not had treatment, step into an environment where some trust can be built to work towards eventually going and having some treatment. I found it absolutely heartbreaking that there's a treatment that somebody can have, but because of their experience, they won't have it. And that was further made worse by last year's experience for the same individual. So I think it's about building trust and confidence, and the psychological services is an opportunity to engage, but to really engage with individuals to say, what's the way that you would want to access some services? Because for some people it would be group, for some people it would be individual, one-to-one. But it is about reaching out rather than just people getting access to the psychological services because they've filled out the form and ticked the box that's in there. I think it's that two-way process of reaching out to those that we know about.
I saw a family whose son had leukemia in his early childhood when he was 5, 6, and had a blood transfusion as a result of that, which resulted in hepatitis C infection, and then obviously all of the treatment thereafter. and he wasn't even able to see me. He had such a mistrust of anybody that he saw associated with authority or anything formal. And I had to see his parents, who very eloquently described his situation. But they said that his lack of trust extended into much broader avenues of his life, into relationships, personal relationships, as well as the more formal relationships with professionals.
Nothing to add from.
Well, can I thank you collectively, Kay, Jackie, Pam, for what you have done for us. As I said before lunch, it's been very, very valuable indeed. But I want to thank you in particular for three things. And the first, and perhaps the most important, is for giving people a voice who would not otherwise have had one. And by goodness, you've given them not only a voice, but a powerful one. Thank you. And secondly, for the empathy which you have, each of you, in your own way, shown. I perhaps may be forgiven for thinking that on occasions there was just a quaver in your voice. And that comes despite having listened and prepared and rehearsed, but you're thinking obviously about the people that you have spoken to, and that is a tribute to you as well as to them. And thirdly, thank you for putting it in a structure which has condensed in many ways the evidence which I can tell you in many ways summarises, echoes, I think, everyone would probably agree, I shall be told in due course if they don't, the evidence that we have listened to over several weeks from individuals who have spoken here and given us their own voices. So it's presenting very much the same picture with all its nuances arising out of the various different events that lots of different people in their own ways have been through. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, we'll take a slightly earlier break for half an hour or so. Let us say, shall we say, 3:20. Can I say to anyone who might be thinking that they are under pressure to get away this evening, that we shall finish this evening no later than 4:30, and it may be that we finish at a convenient moment before then. But I shall see you for the psychosocial experts to start at 3:20. As I said earlier this morning, it is enormously gratifying for me to be able to put before you a panel of experts, of those who are at the very top of their field. And you will see from the evidence which we call first of the expert panels who will give evidence this week, why it is that the psychosocial group follows on so naturally from the evidence we have just finished. No need for me to introduce them individually because their names are in front of them where they will sit. Could they please come forward and be sworn?
Please state your full name
Myfanwy Morgan.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name
Veronica Nicky Thomas.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name
Lesley Fallowfield.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name
Sian Edwards.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name
John Weinman.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Can I ask each of you to just briefly introduce yourselves and explain what your qualifications and areas of expertise are, starting at the far end with Professor Weinman and then moving through the table?
Okay, I'm a professor of psychology as applied to medicine. So I'm someone trained in psychology, originally in clinical psychology, but more recently in health psychology. And so my areas of expertise are very much about understanding the psychological impact of illness and healthcare and treatment on the individual and how people cope with and adjust to illness and how that impacts on recovery or outcome.
As you know, my name's Sian Edwards. I'm here, I've been a nurse as an HIV specialist nurse since 1986. I'm in various countries in the world. Much of that nursing has also been education of healthcare workers and nurses specifically. I worked for 5 years as a as a community haemophilia nurse at St Thomas's, and I followed that up with 2 research projects looking at life histories of people who had HIV and haemophilia, and also the partners, the siblings, the children, and parents of those who had died from HIV, who had had haemophilia. I'm now a research nurse in Australia in HIV.
Hello, I'm a professor of psychosocial oncology, which means psychology is applied to cancer. And I am the director of a health outcomes research group at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. This group looks at the quality of life issues for patients undergoing different cancer treatments. We also develop psychosocial support services for patients and their families coping with life-threatening illness. And importantly and relevant to this inquiry, we do a lot of work developing communication skills training programs for healthcare professionals. And as a part of that, some time ago, I worked very closely with the National Patient Safety Agency on designing a program to run for healthcare professionals on how they should communicate with patients when there was medical error.
My name is Nicky Thomas, and I'm a consultant health psychologist at Guy's and St Thomas's. I recently retired as head of psychology there. My expertise really, as it applies to this hearing, is around supporting people to cope and adjust to physical health problems. I was instrumental in starting a specialist psychology service for people with sickle cell disorders, and that service was then extended to people with haemophilia. So I bring that perspective to this inquiry today.
I'm Myfanwy Morgan. I'm trained as a medical sociologist in London and United States, and then held a variety of clinical posts, academic posts. My research has mainly been with different clinical specialties, focusing on the management of chronic conditions, and my particular contribution has been in terms of eliciting the patients' and families' perspectives and experiences to inform the development of interventions and to assess the outcomes of interventions for patients. And I've also been involved in developing methods of research in order to better further this process.
Thank you. Some of you, I know, attended hearings last year where you heard firsthand some of the evidence of those who were infected or affected. You've also, between you, watched video transmissions on YouTube of the evidence of a number of witnesses, and you were supplied by the inquiry with 47 witness statements and 41 transcripts covering a range of issues to help inform your report. Is that right?
Correct.
Yes.
And can I ask you just to explain briefly how you went about preparing the report? Perhaps Professor Weinman.
Yeah, I took on the role, I'm not sure quite how, as convener. And what we did was to, first of all, have a telephone conference where we all looked at we were asked a whole series of questions, where we looked at the questions and thought about the expertise we had, and a sort of mixture of joint decision-making and a bit of cajoling from me led us to end up with taking charge of different areas of the report, which we've sort of indicated.
But ultimately, it's a collective report.
Very much so.
You've all looked at all of it.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, there are no areas of disagreement professionally between you.
No.
You're also going to be producing a supplemental report responding to what's described as part 2 of the questions in a supplemental letter of instruction dated the 23rd of December.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, there are essentially 5 areas I'm going to ask you about based upon the themes and issues explored in your report. Psychosocial impact, social impact, stigma and discrimination, loss of trust and communication, and care and support. And we'll broadly follow that order. And so I wanted to start perhaps by asking Professor Weinman, but please, anyone else who feels able to, please chip in at any stage with any of the questions. To ask you about what you've set out in section 13.1 of your report, under the heading Psychological Impacts of Infection on People Infected and Affected. You've said, Professor Weinman, in that section that all long-term illnesses have psychological impacts on those with the illness, and any one illness will have effects on an individual's emotional state and their self-identity, as well as giving rise to adjustment to the pain, incapacity, and demands of long-term treatment and lifestyle change. And I wondered if you could elaborate upon that for us, please.
Well, for any of us, an illness or indeed any threat to our health is a sort of threat to one's sense of self and who you are and your place in the world. And anybody who either has a sudden onset or slow onset or whatever of a condition tries to make sense of it. In the first place, they need to try and understand what's going on. So what we know is that people have their own ways of perceiving or making sense of their condition in terms of, what they think's happening, what they think's caused it, how much they think they can do something about it or other people can do something about it, how long it's going to last, and so on and so on. It's sort of likely impact. So everybody will have their own, what we call representation or way of understanding their condition. And that's sort of fundamental in a way, but that really happens in parallel with a whole set of emotional changes that people have. Because a threat to one's health is a threat to one's sense of self and who you are. So everybody who becomes ill will show some sort of emotional reaction, whether it's mild anxiety through to, full-blown depression, really serious psychological impact. But all of that really will be very much governed by how much the illness impacts on one's sense of oneself and one's self-identity. It's absolutely crucial. For some people, they are able to somehow negotiate that and work around the illness and accommodate the illness. For others, it's much more of an invasive process, and the self can be almost completely obliterated in some cases because the impact of illness is so huge and so pervasive in terms of themselves and their family. And those are really fundamental things that happen, that set of emotional changes, that set of what I would call cognitive or thinking changes, the way you think about yourself and your health. And both drive very different sorts of coping. Coping with the emotions, an attempt to try and keep things together, to keep oneself going as an individual, but also to try and deal with whatever it is you're confronted with. And that making sense of process leads very directly to a whole range of different ways of coping. Ways of either, learning more, taking treatment, reaching out to people for support and so on. The whole very complex number of processes, and that happens to everybody, regardless. And I think obviously in the case of people who already had an illness and then were, infected further with, a blood product, then the process becomes even more complicated. Now you're dealing not just with one, sometimes two, and sometimes three conditions with a whole range of treatments. And the having to adjust to things like pain, incapacity, and treatments which sometimes can be truly horrible, as we've heard many times in these hearings, takes a huge toll on the individual and those around them. So I think that's, that what you've really summarised from that, the review on how people cope with illness involves all those processes, which are complex, they're not fixed in time, they change over time as new events emerge, as people perhaps who you were relying on become less reliable, other people become important in your life. So the whole social impact as well is very much part of that process.
And that which you've described, that all long-term illnesses have psychological impacts in the way that you've touched on, that is not, as I understand it, any kind of a new idea. That's something that's been known and understood for many years.
Yeah, very much so. I think what's new is that we understand more about some of those ways that people think and ways that people cope, and particularly ways that they can be supported through an understanding of those very individual processes. Yeah.
Can I ask you a little more about what it is about having long-term illnesses that can have the consequences you describe. You've touched on some of them already. First of all, pain, the psychological impact of coping with pain. What can you tell us about that?
There's a huge amount that's known about the impact of pain on individuals. We know that because, in a way, pain is a very hidden thing, that people who experience it hugely, but pain is not out there. It's not like a broken arm or whatever. That often I think we know that the people are having to cope with pain very much on their own, with other people perhaps not realizing the extent of what they're having to cope with. We know that people cope with pain in many, many different ways. There are questionnaires and assessments which look very specifically at pain coping and particularly how pain in itself activates a lot of those processes I was talking about earlier, the different sorts of thoughts and fears and worries about oneself and one's future. And pain can generate a huge amount of fear, fear of the future, fear of what you can and can't do, and so on. So pain itself, although one can think of it in quite biomedical terms as an experience, it's a very individual and very demanding process, which takes, people cope with in many, many different ways. And I know that when later on we hear about support for patients, it's very much something I think Nicky will talk about.
One of the other factors you touched on, both in your report and in your answer, is incapacity. So the individual who is often suddenly, but sometimes gradually, no longer able to do that which they could previously do. How does that bear upon the psychological experience of the individual?
Well, it's absolutely central in the sense that, disability sort of works at two levels, really, in a way, what the individual can and can't do, and then how that can impact on, again, their identity or as a competent person or someone who can do things, work, be a parent, whatever it is, all those roles. Disability impacts all those roles. But it's also very much something, and again, we'll hear about this more from, I think, particularly from Myfanwy, something which occurs in a social setting. People are often defined by their disability because of things they can't do out there in the real world and the limitations that are placed upon them. So again, it's extremely pervasive. It's something which has a very strong impact both on people's moods, their emotions. So it's not surprising that people with disabling conditions are often very psychologically affected by those. But also, it's very much affected by the attitudes of other people and the support they get from other people. I don't know whether, Sian, you wanted to sort of add to that, really.
Well, I think that whenever we talk about things like this, that we talk about individuals and different people react in different ways to these issues, but the support they get, as we've heard, from health services, from family, from friends, from social groups like churches, are all fundamental on how they're going to be able to cope. And where those groups or those services are not there for them, then you get this idea of separation and isolation and trying to cope with this pain, this incapacity alone. And we know that dealing with things alone has very major psychological impacts on people on a long-term basis. And of course, when many of the things that we have been hearing and talking about, many of these people are children, adolescents, and young people as well as adults.
I can add to that in terms of my work as a clinician. I think a really important area which John has identified is around the notion of being a competent person. So you may have this chronic illness, but you're still a mother, a father. You're also maybe holding down a job, and you're still expected to hold on those. So you're managing multiple roles, and how do you move from those roles in a seamless fashion and then manage a chronic illness as well, some of which is very disabling, like pain and distress. So I think that's a really, really big thing of helping people to move through. And if the support isn't there, then it becomes really overwhelming and difficult.
And how does incapacity potentially bear on the concept that you touched on, the concept of self-identity?
Massively, because the self-identity's got a complex thing, but essentially what it boils down to is how you think about yourself, your sense of self-worth. And as Nicky just said, that can be based around different, we all have different selves, parents, workers, brothers, sisters, whatever. And incapacity can erode any of those bits of oneself in all sorts of very striking ways. And I think we heard very much from both our intermediaries today, and also from what we read in terms of people just feeling they were no longer, that person, that parent, that worker, so that erosion can take place, and that change in one's sense of who you are has huge effects on self-esteem. I mean, massive, because we derive our esteem from those roles, from that sense of who we are.
And what role in the processes have you described as fear and uncertainty about the future have?
Again, this is something that runs through our report, whether we're looking at communication or whether we're looking at the sort of psychological impact. But just in the context of psychological impact, I think, as I was saying right at the beginning, as people try to make sense of what's happening to them and have their own version of what's happening to them in their heads, because they need to have that, because that's how that's where their behaviour comes from. That determines what they're going to do. One of the sort of crucial components of that is something we call timeline. So your sense of how long is this going to last? And if you have an uncertain condition, one that flares, one that maybe responds to treatment, but where maybe treatment makes things worse, that whole sense of the future just remains completely problematic. What's going to be happening in 6 months? What's going to be happening in a year? Can I still do this? Can I keep up with schoolwork? Can I keep up with all of those things then become challenged. There are none of those sort of certainties that were there. So the fear about and the uncertainty about the future arises, I think, from that very fundamental set of changes that happen to the individual and their sense of who they are.
Many of those that the inquiry has heard from are individuals who were told, or whose family members were told, that they had a condition that was life-threatening, particularly if we go back to the 80s, and being told that they had been infected with HIV, being told that there was no treatment available, being told that they were likely to die within a very short period of time. How does that impact both upon the sense of self-identity and the broader psychological condition of the individual?
I mean, one of the reasons why people develop that way, their own way of thinking about an illness, is to develop some sense of mastery and control, to get that back, because that's what goes, when you receive that sort of information. And obviously being given that sort of, very clear, that you haven't got long to live, or, you have a life-threatening illness, absolutely, really impacts on that control, which is very important. Control is really important. In all our lives, control is important, whatever we're doing. But in the context of illness, that really eats into that process hugely. I think the other rather crucial bit of that is the life stage of the individual. And we don't want we've two colleagues missing from our group today who will be here tomorrow. And one of those is Professor Deborah Christie, who works with children and adolescents at Great Ormond Street. And I think in the report, some of the parts that she's written about are very much either about, parents having to protect children from that dreadful, prognostic information, or when the children or adolescents had that. I certainly heard this in one of the hearings I attended. When you have that in your heads, that the sense of, giving up, not making an effort, that just, the lack of motivation to do anything becomes huge, because you're very likely to end up thinking, well, whatever I do, I have no control. This is going to happen. This is inevitable. So that sort of fatalistic view, if you like, again, is very undermining in terms of one's motivation, one's sense of future, one's sense of self. So those are, again, very big effects.
Dr. Thomas, I see you nodding.
Well, I was just sort of agreeing with John, really. Just the control is so important, but the ability to plan one's life, we all take it for granted. We plan our holiday for next year, or, sort of for the summer. But if you have a physical disabling illness, that you can put the plans in place, but the rug is going to be moved from under your feet when the holiday arrives, and so on. And time again, that's been experienced, and it's come through in some of what we've heard in hearings and also in the transcripts, that people inability to plan just takes away the sense of, living life, really. You can't plan for tomorrow, you can't plan for next year. It's just very, very difficult for people, I think.
So one of the things that does come across quite clearly is that lots of people were given that information when they were not actually ill. And I think that was key, because the diagnosis of being told you were HIV positive, many people were given the misinformation you have got. For some people were told 6 months to live, when actually at that moment they were healthy individuals dealing with maybe their haemophilia, but were given 18 months to live, 6 months to live. And that is extraordinarily shocking, to try and negotiate and to navigate around that sort of information. And actually, as time goes on, that 6 months comes and that year comes, and having to live through that channel of uncertainty is a constant for many people, particularly in the early days when there was no treatment.
You've noted in the report that the cumulative effect of multiple medical problems and conditions has been less well studied and is less well understood. But that research has shown a close response relationship between the number of health problems a person experiences and the likelihood of depressive symptoms and impaired quality of life. Can I just invite you to expand upon that?
Sure. It's quite curious that, particularly now as people get older and develop many conditions, not just one, that a lot of the research in my field is just focused on people with diabetes, people with rheumatoid arthritis, haemophilia, whatever. And that lack of research on people with multiple problems is quite staggering, and as I think I alluded to a big review from last year that really pointed that out. And it also partly reflects the way hospitals work. People are treated in one department, another department, as if they're somehow split up, and it's the same person. Where people have looked at people with multiple conditions, certainly the probability and the severity of psychological impact is greater, not surprisingly, as people have, say, 1 or 2 or 3 conditions. So there is, but it's not a linear effect. It's not a stepwise effect. And in fact, and you might go on to ask me this now, what we do know is that the actual severity of someone's condition doesn't necessarily predict their psychological response. There are a whole lot of intervening factors, many of which I spoke about at the beginning. The way people make sense of it, the support they have, how they cope, and so on. So broadly, if we look across at a sort of population level, certainly we know people with more and more conditions are more and more psychologically affected. We know that. But the relationship is quite complex.
And you've identified in your report, as you say, in particular 4 factors that might bear upon the nature or extent of adverse psychological impact. One was severity in terms of clinical conditions and symptoms, patients' perception of their condition, patients' coping responses, and the quality of their support.
Yeah, exactly.
And we'll come on to talk about support in particular later.
May I just add something to that, to pick up on what John has just been talking about, people being treated in silos depending on one condition rather than the multiple comorbidities that they might have. It leads to another problem for them, which is that they will bump into a whole plethora of different healthcare professionals who will give them all sorts of different and sometimes competing information. And one of the anxieties that many people find is exacerbated by this is the fact that they no longer have any continuity of care or information. And therefore an expert in, HIV, AIDS might give totally different information to the haematologist dealing with the, consequences of haemophilia. And I think the disconnect between all the different sources of information that patients and families get can lead to further anxiety. How can I plan? What can I do when I'm getting all this different information from different sources? And I think that that's got a major role in, as I say, exacerbating the uncertainty and anxiety that some individuals feel.
You've said also in the report that the timing and pattern of psychological impact may be different but no less profound for those who are being treated for an ongoing condition. Again, can I ask you to perhaps elaborate upon that a little?
I think it's just this difference between those people who, let's say, are having to cope with haemophilia, which already would be having some pretty profound impacts on their life, and then the next problem arises. So they're already in that situation with an accumulation of problems, and so they're now having to cope with more, deal with more, often deal with harsher treatment. But what one's looking at there, if we go back to our sense of oneself and the identity, people whose self-system is already been quite severely challenged by having an illness, having to accommodate to an illness, and then another one comes along, which is, it's no less devastating. But for someone who is just, living a life without illness and all of a sudden needs a blood product, through accident or childbirth or whatever the situation is, that very sudden onset, it can be, extremely harsh. And that first period of adjustment can be, people are sort of caught in the headlights very much by that, and it can take time to really get one's head around that. So I'm not saying that the impact is any greater or less, but it's a different sort of impact, a different sort of transition of, thinking about who you are and what the future looks like now.
The psychological impacts described by individuals to the inquiry, both orally and in writing, include witnesses who've been diagnosed with recognised psychiatric disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, OCD, bipolar affective disorder, anxiety and depression, in particular anxiety and depression. I'm not going to ask you to comment, obviously, on the circumstances of any individual or the causal link between infection and psychiatric disorder in any individual. But is this fair, that it's entirely plausible to think that infection with HIV, infection with hepatitis C, and the kind of circumstances that we've seen described in the statements might lead to the development of a psychiatric disorder of that kind?
Yeah, we know that, for any major long-term health problem, a proportion of people will develop, major mood change. Typically anxiety in the early stages, but often leading to depression. So, say a group of patients I know well, patients with rheumatoid arthritis. So something like 20-25% of those patients we know will develop those major mood problems because of the changes that are brought about by the condition. But I think what we're dealing with here is not just the psychological reaction to the condition. And I think, in that sense, the whole of the report needs to be sort of perhaps thought of here. What you're dealing with are people who have experienced massive stigma, people who where communication has been poor, where they've perhaps not felt supported or felt even rejected by the healthcare system. I think it's that whole plethora of changes that are really responsible for, the likelihood, that much greater likelihood of people developing, serious psychological problems and reactions.
and then add treatment.
And treatment.
You add the treatment, and this specifically these treatments, particularly interferon and ribavirin, which are debilitatingly. The depression is of an extreme type. So as John said, you're dealing with stigma, you're dealing with loneliness, you're dealing with isolation. So that the amount of factors that actually result in a depressive and sometimes serious psychotic illness is not surprising.
Yeah. And just to add to that, the sort of traumatizing experience of multiple contacts with a very distrustful healthcare system, where you go, and as we've heard, going to many different departments for treating of various problems. And that in itself is very, very traumatic. So you can see how, again, adds to the complexity and make the depression move into another area.
And other psychological or emotional impacts described by infected individuals to the inquiry, again in written and oral evidence, include mood swings, panic attacks, fear, anger, paranoia, loss of confidence, tearfulness, insomnia, nightmares, loss of libido, anhedonia, hopelessness, despair, shock. Those are all, again, the kind of responses that you would understand and expect given the range of different factors and circumstances you've identified.
Very much so, and I think we know quite a lot about the psychological responses of people with, for example, we know quite a lot about psychological responses to people with HIV and AIDS. That's a very big literature there. And that same range of factors would be present in that group, as well as in, obviously, the group of people we're talking about here. I don't know, I mean, you're much more experienced with that group of patients, so what?
Yeah, HIV is a debilitating illness with some very difficult treatments to take. But added on is that stigma. You add on to that the haemophilia, you add on the Hep C, you add on the Hep C treatments. And I think, as John alluded to earlier on, sometimes it's not the severity of the illness that causes the problem. It's the perception of the illness and the self-perception. And many people that we read, and in my own experience, it was the association with, as we heard earlier on, I needed to say who I was and how I became infected. And we live in a world, and certainly we did live in a world that was more severely stigmatising than we do even today with regard to homosexuality and also towards drug users. And when these are associated with these illnesses, you're dealing with an awful lot of factors.
Can I ask about the psychological impacts of treatment in a number of different ways? So you've referred in your report, and we've heard from multiple witnesses, of the very severe physical and mental effects of, in particular, the early treatments. And when I say early, this was over a number of years, for HIV and for hepatitis. So in addition to coping with a life-threatening, serious illness, individuals then had to endure treatment, which in many cases brought symptoms worse than the illness itself. How is that? How may that affect the individual's psychological experience and condition?
And one of the areas I work in, I do a lot of work in now because I'm linked to not only to the School of Medicine, to the School of Pharmacy, is looking at how people cope with and deal with treatments. And what we know is that amongst people with any long-term major condition, around 40-50% of people actually don't make a decision not to follow that treatment long-term. It's what we call non-adherence. Because in many cases, that treatment, they feel worse when they're on the treatment. So it's a sort of decision that people can and do make quite commonly. And obviously, what we heard from many of our witnesses, that particularly in the early days, when some of those very harsh treatments that didn't really seem to actually even be working, and they were relentless and went on, and where symptoms didn't clear and so on, and there's sort of people again weigh up in their own minds: is it really, at the end of the day, is it really worth me going on with this? So that's one set of issues. The treatments themselves cause a lot of symptoms that people then have to cope with in a whole range of ways. And there's this terrible conflict which can happen inside people's heads about, well, needing and wanting to take the treatment with the possibility of getting better. But then actually all the evidence that comes back, the feedback is that either the condition, the Hep C, has not cleared, or that there's no difference in the viral load, or whatever the issue is. And I think that set of conflicts that people are faced with is huge. And when we look at non-adherence to treatment, which is often criticised, by a lot of my medical colleagues I work with, and I work across a range of conditions, are very critical of people who don't adhere to treatment. Here we're offering them possibility of getting better, and they're not. And we know, from huge reports, WHO and otherwise, that many people make that choice because they don't, at the end, either don't believe in the treatment. There are also issues about not trusting the provider of that treatment, which I know we'll get onto. And so people are then left with, sometimes a bit of a sense of guilt. I'm not really doing what I should be doing. Sometimes the people around them can be critical because they may not be thinking that the person's making sufficient effort with the treatment and so on. So it's quite a complex set of issues there. Apart from the actual psychological impact, as you say, the pain, the side effects and other aspects of treatment, there are a whole lot of issues about having to continue with something which doesn't seem to be doing you any good. In fact, making you actually feel worse.
And you've identified various subcategories of that in your report. People completing the treatment, enduring it for prolonged periods of time, only for the treatment to be unsuccessful. And what's that experience potentially like for an individual psychologically and emotionally?
Truly awful, because, you've struggled with that terrible conflict and you've stuck with it in the belief, and beliefs are huge in illness, beliefs in treatment, beliefs about the nature of the condition and so on, in the belief that ultimately you're going to get the benefit. So you've struggled for a long period of time. So when it turns out that actually nothing has changed, or sometimes things have actually become worse, then that is really devastating, having gone through that struggle. Even when, I don't know, maybe you're going to come on to this, but even when people have been through a major treatment and actually, let's say, some symptoms have cleared or a condition has cleared, and I think Lesley will know more about this from working cancer, that people can still be left with quite major doubts about whether this thing has really gone away, because their experience is still there. They might be getting symptoms and so on. So I think we refer to that as a fear of recurrence, people worrying that somehow, because we're not experts on our own bodies, we don't know what's happening inside us. So this whole notion that there could still be something in there, that fear of recurrence, which is quite a crippling, quite a ruminative sort of process, can really stop people in their tracks as well.
It also makes people hyper-vigilant about any symptoms as well. And I think there's two other difficulties here, I think, that we ought to touch on, which is that certainly at the beginning of many of the treatments, the likely benefits were very uncertain. Medicine, anyway, is not the certain science we'd love it all to be. And those treated sort of in the early stages when people were offering them some, they had very little evidence that it would be beneficial. And as John says, it's the same in cancer. Some people, even if they do get some respite from the disease, isn't showing signs of progression, nevertheless can't enjoy that sort of freedom or the fact that some of the tests look quite positive, because they are so anxious about when it's going to actually re-emerge. And that becomes paralysing in terms of enjoying, you know, life and what is in front of you.
I said the other thing about particularly these treatments with interferon and ribavirin is that for many people they didn't have symptoms, and so their illness could remain anonymous. You didn't have to tell anybody. But once you start a treatment like that, you are so unwell. And often people weren't aware they were going to be that sick. And it changes everything, your work, your parenting, everything in your life if you are that unwell with the fatigue and the depression that it comes. And that means that you then have to disclose the reason for your ill health. And so there's major complexities to some of these treatments and the psychological impact that they have, because you can't hide it anymore.
We'll come back to the impact of loss of trust, poor communication and stigma and discrimination. But I just wanted to ask you about one observation that you made in your report on page 2. You've talked in this context of the negative effects on academic, behavioural and social adaptation. And I wondered if you could elaborate upon that, please.
I think there are sort of 2 or 3 main elements to that, really. One is that, and obviously we're looking at school-aged individuals, and when you know, what we heard from, certainly from parents and from, you know, people who've been infected, that when you feel so bad, you know, you're fatigued, you've got pain, you've got symptoms and so on, and you're feeling nauseous, you don't want to be at school. So we know there are a lot of school absences, and again, we see this in other conditions. When you're at school, you can't really engage that well. Sadly, children pick that up. Those people often are not supported unless, you know, fellow children are well informed. I mean, there are some good examples of where schools did make a huge effort and provided support, but they were very much in a minority. And I think, so then school becomes a really aversive experience for individuals. Not only is it hard going, you have patchy attendance, so you fall behind. So there are a whole lot of social effects, if you like, of the symptoms that get in the way of, consistent schooling. And so people are falling behind with all the negative reactions that follow. I think that's one aspect, but the other is that for some of those treatments, and for certainly, well, we know with HIV can have neuropsychological effects. It can impact on brain function in a range of ways. But certainly a lot of those very harsh early treatments also had, negative effects on cognitive functioning, the ability to concentrate, to remember, to problem solve, all those basic skills that one needs to assimilate schoolwork from and so on. So I think, at a functional level and at a social level, school becomes very challenging for a lot of individuals. And I think those, they're not separate because those things interact very much, but both have profound effects on people's ability to both to engage and benefit and process all the information that one needs. Because whatever we think about schooling, it is very much a time when we have to process a lot of information and do stuff and keep up. And I think that becomes very hard when all those other negative things are going on.
You've picked up in this section of your report on evidence that you read or saw about the effect of watching others die. Mm. And we know from the evidence that we've heard that in the absence of formal support networks, people formed their own support networks through a range of different groups or organisations. People within the haemophilia community, knew each other through attending centres or through attending Trelawn's school, and you've picked up and quoted in your report the experiences of those of going to multiple funerals. And I wanted to ask you two aspects of the psychological implications of that. The first is survivor's guilt. Could you explain that concept further for us?
But it's something that's widely reported in a lot of different areas, not only in illness but also in military situations and so on, that people, and I think we heard it a little bit from our intermediary panel earlier, that people who are in a dreadful situation but survive it often feel very bad about those who didn't make it. And there's that whole, whereas often, when something awful happens to us, we go through the why me, why does it happen to me, and that whole self-blame. But here, the self-blame is of a very curious sort. It's sort of almost blaming yourself for surviving, and feeling bad that you weren't part of the group that were left behind. It's a very powerful set of emotions that can be very debilitating. But because it's sort of blame, a sense of blame towards oneself, it's a very potent source of depression. We know that when people experience that, the likelihood of becoming depressed is very high. I know, Sian, if you wanted to, because you must have seen a lot of people in that situation.
Essentially, you go to a support group for support and friendship, and to share your experiences. But when that support group slowly diminishes because people are getting sicker and then dying, the impact can change. And so that you are no longer getting the support, you're actually witnessing what may well be happening to you very soon. So yes, it can be very counterproductive, but without a doubt, support groups are there, and they're very powerful, and peer group support. And I know throughout the haemophilia community that has been very, very strong, but it does have the side effect of having to watch your friends, and of course in this situation your brothers, your uncles, your school mates die. It's a very unusual and very, very difficult thing to go through, which is not usual with health.
You've touched there on a second element of experiencing multiple friends dying, attending multiple funerals. Witnesses have talked about how they wondered when it was going to be their turn next. So it presumably increases that sense of fear and uncertainty and lack of control, loss of self-identity again.
Yeah, massive increase in vulnerability, I think. But I think also, there was a lot of people in adolescence and young adults who are having to see. I mean, it's so unusual in our lives to see. We maybe watch grandparents. There are certain people perhaps where death is expected, but to see so many of your colleagues, taken away, it's huge. Multiple bereavements. Bereavement itself, again, it's something I know we'll talk about. Has quite a big psychological toll. That whole grief process. But to have that again and again and again, again, there's very little research literature on that. But when the little that is there show that can be, again, very, very overwhelming for individuals to have to go through it in a serial sort of way, not only taking support, but actually experiencing all that multiple layered grief, really.
There are, I think I picked this up from your report, very few studies specifically looking from a psychosocial perspective at the experiences of those infected through blood and blood products. I know you've drawn attention, I won't take time with putting it on screen, but it's now part of the inquiry's material, to one short research paper by Reaver and others from 2017. Are you aware of whether there's been any broader research, whether from a psychological, psychosocial or psychiatric perspective, into these issues, specifically in relation to those infected through blood or blood products?
I tried very hard to find a good research base for that, and it wasn't there. I contacted journal editors For example, I know the editor of a big American journal called HIV Behaviour, and asked him to go back through his records. I looked very widely. That Reva paper, it's not really a paper. I mean, it's a sort of bit of an overview on some of the psychological consequences, the neuropsychological effects, and then looking at medico-legal issues. So it's not even a sort of an empirical paper. So I don't know whether colleagues had similar. We found it very hard. It's yeah.
And I sort of spoke to psychologists in the field, and they also didn't have anything to recommend as well. So it's very poorly researched.
One particular feature from the evidence that the inquiry has had, and this may be particularly relevant to the concept of self-identity that you've described, is that for many people their whole lives have become defined by the condition with which they were infected and treatment for it, the symptoms and so on, with the result that they have had to live a life completely different from the life that they would otherwise have expected to do, and they have lost opportunities, been unable to fulfil a potential that would otherwise have been there. Again, how does that bear upon their psychological experiences?
Well, again, hugely, because going back to what I was talking about earlier about one's sense of self, one's sense of self-identity, I think some people have said, if you think of illness as a sort of set of things and oneself as a set of things, and for some people, the sense of oneself can be completely obliterated, and I think we heard this, because day to day, this is what's happening to you, there is nothing else. So those multiple selves, one's future selves, all those really important dimensions become pretty well wiped out. And again, that is from an experiential point of view, but also in terms of if you like, people's aspirations, particularly young people, absolutely devastating. The idea of having no obvious future or incredibly uncertain future, which is completely dictated by this thing which is now defines you, is massively impactful. Yeah.
There is a point, of course, where that may not happen to some individuals, and people can redefine themselves and go on to be parents, to be, to go to universities, to get degrees, to get good jobs. And I think although that many of the things we are talking about are in generalisations, are very valid generalisations, there are individuals who have overcome enormous challenges to have a very strong identity. And I think we need to acknowledge that as well.
But there are internal processes that give you your self-identity. But I think one of the things that I think we were all struck by were the external processes that define somebody as being the AIDS boy, the woman with Hep C. Sometimes they assumed titles from outside that defined them, no matter how much they struggled to actually define themselves in other terms. People having, sort of AIDS painted on their houses and everything. That's an external process that's going to really affect how you feel internally as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back really to look at what I've said and what Sian and Lesley just said, that notion of the self, the illness. What we know is, and in fact you can do this, a number of studies where you say to people, just draw your sense yourself, draw the illness. And some people literally draw one on top of the other. They are consumed by it. But there are other people who sort of put the illness out there somewhere, or with a little bit of an overlap. And so they're coping with it in different ways. Maybe they have better support, and so on. So that, there is huge variation. I think we need to stress that variation. And I think we also alluded to the fact, and I've seen this in quite a number of major illness groups, some people go on actually derive benefit from having gone through that process, and that process of so-called benefit finding, seeing the sort of silver lining, if you like, in this horrible cloud, is something that can really get people through, and it's not that uncommon. You know, certainly in the cancer literature, in the heart disease literature, it's benefit finding. You know, you go through something dreadful, but you emerge from it stronger. You do other things. You cope well. And so I think it really goes back to this huge variation, and that we must not generalise. Yeah.
You've talked about the position of children and adolescents, and we'll come back to that with Professor Christie tomorrow. But can I ask about what might be the particular psychological, psychosocial challenges for those who have survived, who have aged with infection, who didn't expect to survive, and who made their life decisions accordingly, but who find themselves several decades on still here? What could you tell us about the experience of people who might fall within that category?
I think throughout the HIV patient group specifically, there was so much information in the early days about death. You're going to die. Spend your money. Don't bother going to school. You know, you have 2 or 3 years to live it well, because you're not going to be here. And many of those people did die, but there are many people, and who are sitting here today, who, you know, come the late 1990s and treatment was at last effective, who, although that was a huge celebration in many ways, it was a major readjustment, and people had not planned for that future. Basic things like finance, spent money that had been given, had travelled the world, had made decisions based on the fact that their life would not be long. And I am very aware of the amount of conversations I've had with people who would discuss that point and say, I wasn't ready for that. It was really confusing, really confronting to be able to have to need to stand up and go, okay, you mean I'm now going to live? Then I need to make some more major adjustments to the life in front of me, and had wasted many opportunities because they did not believe they were going to live.
Can I ask you about the psychological impact of everything you've described on family members, partners, parents, children, siblings, and others? Many of those who are affected through the infection of a loved one, who've given evidence to the inquiry, have described psychological and emotional symptoms similar to those described by the person who was infected. Does that surprise you?
Not at all. No. I mean, we know that it's very hard for parents looking after children with major illness. We know that's hard, you know, not just in this area. But I think a lot of the challenges for the parents and the families we heard from were as much about how one managed that in the broader setting of their lives, and the need for secrecy, the often distortions of communication that went on, somebody knew, somebody else didn't know, and so on. So I think the apart from the very serious impact of having a child with a life-threatening condition, I think some of the sort of distortions and in communication that almost don't even want to call them games, but the things that people had to do just to keep their heads above water, not telling people, and a lot of avoidance went on, both by people who are, avoidance in the sense don't talk about it, don't deal with it. Avoidance seemed to be a very common response, and a very understandable response, because, why would you want other people to know about something which, potentially is very stigmatizing? The problem with avoidance, people cope, as I said earlier, people cope with illness in a whole range of ways. Avoidance being quite a common way of responding. I've certainly seen lots of patients who say, oh, no, I don't really have the problem. But the problem with avoidance is early on, when you first have a major problem, avoidance is not a bad thing. It can sort of keeps you going for a bit. But avoidance in the long term, we know from a huge number of studies now, is something that does not lead to good outcomes, because actually whatever it is still there, and you haven't dealt with it. You haven't worked out as a family or as a parent how you're going to be coping with it. And that, is one of the many sort of threads, I think, that run through a lot of those family experiences, the sort of secrecy, the avoidance and so on. And it would have, I didn't really see it, but I'm sure there would be families out there where that wasn't the case, where communication was open and good and people felt supported. But we did hear a lot about the, really quite problematic aspects of, communication, secrecy, avoidance, all those sorts of issues.
It's very fascinating. It's riveting. I made a promise we would finish
4:30.
4:30. It's now 4:31.
I'm very sorry. I was just about to say I want to go to some of the literature relating to impacts upon parents and spouses and other family members, and the perfect time to do that would seem to be tomorrow morning.
Thank you very much so far. And what I was saying about it being riveting and fascinating is certainly true as far as I am concerned. So thank you very much thus far. For everyone else, it'll be 10:30 tomorrow morning. So please, if you wish to, if you are as fascinated as I am, and you have arranged to be here, then 10:30. 10:30.